So it's Jane Austen July. It's my first year on BookTube. So what do? I read Jane Austen for the first time. So growing up, we're assigned classics in school, and for the most part, I read every single book I was assigned. The only book I did not read was my senior year of high school, and it was Pride and Prejudice. And I didn't read it because someone who was in a different class, who had already read it, told me I would have hated it. And at the time, I probably would have. So I'm glad that I've never read Jane Austen before. Now, Jane Austen is very loved. She is a very famous author, not just on BookTube, but just in the world at large. And most people have heard of Pride and Prejudice and probably have seen a adaptation, read a retelling, etc. Somehow, I have never watched an adaptation of any of Jane Austen's books, and to the best of my knowledge, I have never read a retelling. So I am super fresh. I know the basics of some of them, but that's because I've been doing my research, because I'm like, where do I want to start? So I went to BookTube. And a lot of people have guides to Jane Austen or ranking lists. The first video I watched was Brian at Bookish, because he just posted one. He did a Mansfield Park and Emma review, and then he did his ranking list. And his ranking list was from favorite to least favorite: Persuasion, Pride and Prejudice, Emma, Sense and Sensibility, Mansfield Park, and Northanger Abbey. I expected Pride and Prejudice to make the top 3 of all of these lists. Next, I went to Murphy Napier. She has a ranking list, and she also has a guide. So on her ranking list, she had Pride and Prejudice, Emma, Sense and Sensibility, Northanger Abbey, Persuasion, and then Mansfield Park. Moving on to Books and Things. Again, 1st to 6th. Pride and Prejudice, Mansfield Park, which I found very interesting, Persuasion, Emma, Northanger Abbey, and Sense and Sensibility. Katie at Books and Things also included Lady Susan, but because no one else included it in their rankings, and she very much advocates that you read it, I wasn't going to start with it though, so I just removed it from her ranking list. Okay, I'm editing and I have no idea how I forgot to say this. Of course, also I had to add Katie from Books and Things because she is one of the hosts and creators of Jane Austen July, which is like a sensation on this small part of BookTube. So I also felt that I have to point out that the only reason I'm doing this is because of her work into this. Okay, so for Jasmine Reads, her order is Persuasion, Pride and Prejudice, Emma, Sense and Sensibility, Mansfield Park, and then Northanger Abbey. There's so many ranking videos. I wanted to do an average of tons of them, but it would have just taken a long time, and these are all people I watch, so I'm familiar with their reading tastes at least a little bit, so I decided it was easier to go with them. So the least favorite on average was Northanger Abbey, then Mansfield Park, Sense and Sensibility, Emma, Persuasion, and then coming in at number 1, of course, is Pride and Prejudice. So I listened to what they had to say in respect to their rankings too, just to get an idea of if I think I would like them or how I would want to start getting into Jane Austen, because I have this tendency to just pick someone's most famous book and then maybe not like it, and then be scared to get back into someone. So I decided I was going to put a lot more thought into this process. Now let's start removing some from the playing field, because there's some of these for sure I'm not going to read. In 6th came Northanger Abbey. I'm not going to read that as my first entry. It's supposed to be satirical. Your narrator breaks down the fourth wall and talks to you and explains things. And while I think at a premise level I would like that, it doesn't seem like the best entry point into Jane Austen, just in case it doesn't really work for me in some capacity. Number 5, Mansfield Park. It's interesting because everyone but Katie at Books and Things put this in either 5th or 6th. And she even said in her ranking that when she first read it, she didn't really like it. And then upon reread, when she read it at university, that was when it bumped up for her and she really loved it. And in Bookish's video, Brian did say that from what he has seen, this is a book that upon reread does grow in taste, I guess. That's obviously not a good entry point into Austen. Sense and Sensibility. It makes sense to me that this is fourth because everyone kind of just had like more neutral things to say about it. I think Jasmine even said in hers that it's just like perfectly Austen. Like she does everything that she does like in it, but there's no like greatness about it in contrast to her other books. So Sense and Sensibility is out. Number 3 is Emma. Now going into this is the one I was thinking I would read because it's a character focus, and from what I've seen, the character of Emma is unlikable at the beginning, and I love myself an unlikable narrator. And apparently she has a really great character arc, which I also really appreciate, and I don't really think that you get super often in like standalones. So I'm very interested in reading Emma. Number 2 is Persuasion. 3 of the people had it in their top 3, and Murphy had it at 5. And the reason Murphy said she had it as 5 is it's because it's a second chance romance, and she doesn't like that trope as much. So it was already not going to be a number 1 for her. This one it wasn't even on my radar to read, but after hearing everyone talk about it, I'm kind of more interested in it, but like maybe not as a first entry. I don't know. I could be persuaded to read Persuasion, and that was intentional. You're welcome. Okay, number 1, Pride and Prejudice. This is the one that in high school I didn't read, and I'm not going to be reading it first now. I don't think that for me it's quite the entry point I'm looking for. It has a lot more characters, so it's, from my understanding, so it's not focusing on one character in particular, which I think is what I'm looking for more in my first Austen book. I don't think I want the complexity that this book has, and I don't think I'm really in the mood for that at this moment either. I also think that it has so much hype. I mean, it's her most famous book currently, which means it's her most read book, which means if you ask the average person what their favorite Jane Austen is, they're probably going to say this because this is probably the only one that they've read, and they might love it, but you know what I mean? It skews your data pool. But then, I mean, I'm looking at 4 huge readers who have read all of her books, and Pride and Prejudice is in the first or second slot for everyone, and it's only beaten by Persuasion with Brian and Jasmine. And it's interesting because Brian and Jasmine have the exact same ranking order. I did comment on Brian's video saying I was going to read these soon, and I was trying to figure out my order, and he responded. So let's see what words of wisdom he gave me. The only caution I would give you about starting with Emma is that it is a bit longer than some of the others, but I know several booktubers for whom Emma was their first Austen, and for whom it remains their favorite. I don't know how you feel about spoilers, but I actually found that watching some of the movies and adaptations before I read the books made the books more manageable. Somehow already knowing what was going to happen made it easier to follow the plot and keep all the characters straight. I think that's good advice. I actually read A Song of Ice and Fire and didn't really like it and didn't want to continue. Then I watched like the first 4 seasons, and then I reread it and ended up really liking it because of that exact reason. I had context. I kind of knew what was going to come. I wasn't super confused on who characters were. I didn't really have to take notes. I don't really take notes while I read. If I start to get confused, I might watch an adaptation of whichever one I'm reading. And I know that Katie at Books and Things has a list of her favorite adaptations, which I would follow. So, Emma or Persuasion? I guess we're going to figure out what I choose to read in the next clip. I picked both books up from the library because I wasn't sure which one I was going to end up reading, so I wanted to read the first few pages of each one, and I just have to point this out. This is Emma. This is Persuasion. These are the same face, and they're both published by Everyman's Library, and the same person is credited with both of these cover designs. And I'm like, you had no creative juices going that day. Like, what is this? This one especially, it's like uneven. Her face is on the side. It just makes me angry. I read the first chapter of Emma, and then I attempted to read the first chapter of Persuasion, but I don't know why, but just how it was written, I was getting like, the writing style wasn't working for me, even though it's by the same author. I don't know. I was getting like confused in like the writing, and so I was already more intrigued by the start to Emma, so this is the one I'm gonna read. It's the one I thought I was gonna read starting this off. It is quite a bit longer. It is almost 500 pages, so I'm probably not gonna finish this in July for Jane Austen July, but we're just gonna go into August. And I just finished chapter 2, so it looks like we're really just kind of getting introduced to characters and their disposition, and like kind of getting a feel for the character field at this point. I'm also noticing that we're not really getting any of the setting described at all. It's more of just like inferred based on the wealth. They just like talk about how big the places are, say that they have a stable, just very simple things. It's descriptive, but it's also pretty dialogue heavy. So there's just a line where Harriet Smith is coming over for the first time. She was a very pretty girl, and her beauty happened to be of a sort which Emma particularly admired. She was short, plump, and fair, with a fine bloom, blue eyes, light hair, regular features, and a look of great sweetness. I just think it's interesting how beauty standards have changed, and it's a known thing, but just that she's supposed to be beautiful, and she's short, plump, and fair. And if you look at beauty standards nowadays, that's definitely not what it is. So I just finished chapter 4, and I'm already really getting into the groove of this. At first the writing was kind of hard for me to follow, but I think as I keep reading it's going to get easier and easier. It's just like getting into like the different syntax, and I'm having to Google words like way more often than usual because there's a lot of unfamiliar language in here. We've started to see the unlikableness of Emma by means of her matchmaking. Her matchmaking is more of like interference, like how Harriet was potentially interested in Mr. Martin, who is like too low end for Emma, and she's just like basically like trying to convince Harriet that he's like no good because like he doesn't have like the genteel attitude and posture of a true gentleman, and Harriet, she feels, is kind of like dumb, and she's like way higher society wise, so like there's obviously a power dynamic going on here, and Harriet kind of just agrees with everything Emma says because, you know, Emma has power over her in this situation. And so I think it's kind of funny, like, how obnoxious she is, but I can see how people could find it annoying. And Mr. Knightley already, you know, knows that, like, Emma's up to no good. So this is gonna have spoilers in it, by the way. I don't think I mentioned that in the beginning. I also forgot to mention the age difference between Emma and Harriet, which also adds to the dynamic since Harriet's under 17, so it's like this woman of wealth and high society has taken her under her wing, and she's just kind of like a little duckling, like, yes ma'am, no ma'am. So there's a conversation happening between Mr. Knightley and Miss Taylor, who is now Mrs. Weston, and they're talking about Emma, like, having no patience and no industry to, like, take the time to actually do something. She likes fast results. And they're specifically talking about reading and how she doesn't really, like, have the patience to read a book. And I really like that because I think, unpopular opinion, but I really don't like when a protagonist in a book is a reader or really likes to read, or like that's like a big thing about the protagonist. All authors most likely like to read, so it's like an author like putting themselves into a book, and it's kind of to me like the protagonist of a movie being really into film. Like, who cares? I don't know. I just don't find it very creative. I'm still pretty early on in the book, but I'm reading Emma's dad as having some sort of mental health issue, like maybe he's agoraphobic and doesn't like going outside, or maybe he what's the word, like always thinks everything's gonna make people sick. I don't know. It doesn't really seem like he works because he's never had to. So there's like a lot of oddities going on that I'm reading as like mental health issues that are probably not going to be checked because of when this was written. Okay, question for you guys. There's multiple times in this text where there's a quote, like there's dialogue happening, and there's parentheses within the quote, but it's not unquoted. So I wonder how you're supposed to interpret it, or how you interpret it, because I'm interpreting it as they're not actually saying that out loud, but it's a way to get across like sarcasm or like subtext of how they're implying it, like maybe how they would be inflecting, because that's what they're kind of thinking as they're saying it. It also kind of seems like something that would happen, and I think does happen in some like old plays, where it's like someone says something to the people and then they like break the fourth wall and kind of like whisper something to their audience, or like monologue something to themselves, so like they're the only ones that hear it. This might have been something that was more frequent at the time, but I haven't come across it, so yeah, just wondering what you guys think. So I find this quote interesting. It's Emma speaking about Mr. Martin and Harriet, and she's to Mr. Knightley, and she says, "Mr. Martin may be the richest of the two, but he is undoubtedly her inferior as to rank in society. The sphere in which she moves is much above his. It would be a degradation." So there's a lot of talk about class in here, which I kind of knew coming into it, but it's just so interesting and so self-indulgent that she's like, oh, like Harriet's way above him in society, but the only reason that is because she's like taken this like random teenager under her wing to like try to better her and like make more of a lady of her, even though like she really technically doesn't have any like business per like class being in that class and like being with Emma. It's like a charity case almost. Also, Emma's gonna end up with Mr. Knightley, right? I'm only 60 pages in, but like I think that's what's gonna happen. He's the only person that like can keep up with her and like call her on her bullshit. So I'm only like 70 pages in, so really not that far at all, but I'm interested to see how Emma's character arc kind of develops, because she's disagreeable and like almost obnoxiously self-assured, and she meddles in things that she shouldn't, but at the core of it, it seems like she's doing it because she's lonely. At the beginning of the book, Mrs. Weston left and got married, and she had been like a mother figure to Emma, and almost more than that, they were more friends than anything, and they spent hours having what she considered intellectual conversations with this person, and she obviously can't have that with her dad because her dad seems not totally with it, and so she latches on to the first person she finds, which is Harriet, and Harriet doesn't provide that for her, which is why she just wants to mold her into the person she is, or the person she wants Harriet to be, and the person I think that she wants to be in some capacity. To me, it just drives with this core of Emma being very lonely and not really understanding how to navigate that. There are characters that are unlikable, but I think people still prefer them to Emma, and I think it's because she's calculated in everything she does, and like she thinks through the things she's doing to people that are like bad to them before she even does it, and it comes across as manipulative. But in all fairness, I just read the scene where her sister is back, like, visiting the family, and her dad and her sister are having, like, literally the most dreadful conversation I could imagine. If I had to sit there and listen to that, I would be like, oh my god, let me find something more exciting in my life to do. And so, if that's her company, I honestly can't blame her. You know, as I think it could easily be predicted, Mr. Elton wasn't into Harriet at all and was actually interested in Emma. And Emma was totally disgusted by that when she figured it out, and she also, like, had a lot of guilt about how she was trying to pair up Mr. Elliot and Harriet, and she's not guilty that she had Harriet reject another offer, but she's guilty for the part she played in it. And, anyway, I think that that's just, like, a moment of some growth in her, though not a lot, because she's still really trying to push Harriet away from the Martins and really meddle in her life. But now we've met the prodigal son, Frank Churchill, who we knew was going to end up coming at some point, and I'm not totally sure how I feel about him yet. We met him a few chapters ago. Like, Emma is attempting to suss out how she should feel about him, and then she ends up deciding, based on other people's reactions and her first impressions, that she does like him. It seems like he's going to take up a lot of the plot at this point. I'm interested for, I am saying the right name, right? Mr. Elliot. I'm looking forward to him coming back with his wife that he now has, because he got engaged very quickly. And, yeah, I'm kind of just interested to see where this plot goes. People in general talk about, like, from videos I've seen, talk about who people end up with, if they like the romances, or how the couples end at the end of the book. So obviously Emma is going to end up with someone. I'm curious and trying to figure out who. She doesn't really seem interested in anyone. Like, even when she's talking to Churchill, she wants to, like, she keeps bringing up Jane, and she constantly is bringing up other women and trying to match them up instead of, like, focusing on herself in any capacity. I'll be interested to see where this goes, because it makes me feel like she's just not interested in men at all, and I'm, like, not reading her as, like, heterosexual at all. Like, she just isn't putting out those vibes to me at this point. But, I mean, this was written in the 1800s. I doubt that's actually where Jane Austen was going with this, but that's just how I'm reading her right now. As I'm reading this book, I just have this recurring thought about how awful it sounds to be, like, a person from, like, a high class in society back then. Like, their lives and the things that they talk about are seriously so dull. Like, I honestly just, like, can't imagine a bigger punishment than having to act like these people do constantly when they're around people. Like, no one really says what they're thinking, and everyone's plotting against each other, and yeah, just, the reading experience is fine. I'm enjoying the book a little bit. I'm, like, enjoying it as I'm reading it, but I have no like, I'm never feeling a drive to pick it up, which is why I thought I would get this book read in a week, and, at the end of July, and, oops, we are now, like, over halfway through August. Oops. I think that I just don't really like a lot of the characters. People don't have an attachment to Emma because Emma isn't very, you know, nice, but you might like the other characters or whatever. I'm having kind of the opposite, where I'm indifferent to most of the characters except for Emma. I like Emma. I appreciate her thoughtfulness. Not, like, thoughtfulness towards people, but just, like, the thoughts that she has. I'm intrigued by her. And I feel like I'm not intrigued by most other people. I don't really trust Churchill, Frank Churchill. I don't know, something about him gives me weird vibes. And I was never interested in Mr. Elton. Harriet is kind of just like a wallflower. Is that the right word for her? Emma's dad is very strange. And I like Mr. Knightley quite a bit, but he's not been on the page much for a while. And Elton just got married, so we're probably going to get him back in again. We just met his wife, who Emma hates and I also hate. So, yeah, I don't know. Like, people say Emma's unlikable, but I'm like, but maybe Emma has the right idea about some things. Like, not saying she should meddle in people's business, but Emma has a lot of understanding of people and how people work. She observes people a lot of the time, but I find it interesting that she like doesn't see her own faults in herself, in others. So she really hates Mrs. Elton, but she is particularly annoyed with Mrs. Elton's obsession with Jane Fairfax and like her wanting to like take her into society and show her the ways. And it's essentially what Emma is doing with Harriet. She might be a little less obvious with it and a little less declarative of her wealth, but it's conceptually she's still doing the same thing. I just finished volume 2, and this seems like a good time to kind of just check in on how I'm feeling about the book at large. I thought I would be enjoying it more than I am. I think some of that has to do with the length. I'm about 300 pages in. We have very detailed scenes where we're watching accounts of side characters go back and forth and back and forth. And I don't mind unlikable characters, but I find pretentious, wealthy characters extraordinarily annoying. So, and I'm not talking about Emma here. Mrs. Elton, very annoyed by her. When people bring up money and wealth and, like, trying to lift people up by, like, lift up others into society, which I think was a thing at the time, like, young woman in the higher class kind of, like, adopting in some capacity maybe women that are a bit younger than them from, like, a lower class, like the Jane Fairfax thing and the Harriet thing. I find uninteresting. I've also, I think, have been expecting more character growth from Emma. I've found she's not meddling in people's business as much, but I almost now find that we're more focusing on the background characters and less on her, and I found her faults in the beginning to be fun to read, and we're not seeing those as much anymore, so I'm losing a little bit of interest there. I'm curious to see how this third part wraps up. Frank Churchill's coming back to town, so she's going to have to confront her feelings about him and her ideas of marriage, which I'm intrigued to read. I'm also interested to see what happens with Mr. Knightley, because we just found he has just said he's not interested in Jane Fairfax. I don't know if I believe him, but he also seemingly does not like Churchill, which makes me think that he's jealous, and Emma doesn't like Jane, so I feel like there's some jealousy going on both sides of Knightley and Emma, so we'll see what happens in part 3. I get that we are supposed to understand that Miss Bates can talk and talk and talk and talk and talk, but I cannot read another full page of her just broken sentences here and there, talking maybe to someone, maybe to no one, maybe just talking at people. I have no idea. She drives me crazy. I feel like I could have seen that once on the page, and I would have understood it, and then it could have been just a sentence about her talking at length to no one in particular, and I would have gotten, like, the message, as opposed to actually having to hear those things, or read those things, over and over and over again. Reading part 3, I am becoming more convinced again by the plot, and I am more interested in what I'm reading. I feel like the plot picked up. I don't think we're gonna meet more characters at this point. I don't like all the characters, but I feel that Austen did a really great job of like seamlessly weaving the characters into the narrative so that it all felt natural. I feel like sometimes when characters get introduced later on in a book, it can kind of feel like weird, and that didn't feel this way at all, especially with the Mrs. Elton, who is just horrible. And Knightley just like admonished Emma, and Emma's feeling really horrible of how she reacted to Miss Bates, and Knightley kind of gives her a good lesson on, you know, it's not just what you said, it's like the power dynamic of you and her, and like your feelings change other people's feelings of people because you're a position of power in society. And she's feeling like the first remorse we've really truly seen, where it's like weighing heavily on her. So I'm now seeing that like character change that you're having. And Knightley is also on the fence about Churchill, which I don't know what his vibe is. Like I can't suss it out. I think that Emma is convinced that Harriet was referring to Churchill when she talked about admiring someone or him helping her out of a situation, but I actually think she's talking about Knightley, but we'll see what happens. I think that if I had read this as a teenager or read this type of work, I wouldn't be picking up on a lot of the cues that Austen is giving us. She's letting you know she's setting stuff up, and she kind of gives you, like, she I don't know if it's foreshadowing really, but she gives you an idea of what's going to happen, like, a little bit before it actually does, so you're able to connect the pieces once it occurs. Though I don't quite feel that way, or that we've kind of figured out who Emma's going to end up with. I mean, like, if I didn't know that she was going to end up with someone based on what people talk about with the books and how they always end up with someone, I would think she wouldn't be. Alright, so she just didn't apologize, but went to see them the day after, Miss Bates the day after, and, like, Mr. Knightley found out, but not because Emma brought it up, because Emma's dad brought it up, and they had, like, a moment, and I was like, I fucking knew that. I called this in, like, the first few chapters, like, they were gonna be the end game, and that is all. So Knightley's suspicions were confirmed, and as I thought, Frank was sneaky, and he had been, I thought he had something going on with Jane, but I hadn't realized it had been, like, before he even came to, wherever the heck they live. I wish that Jane's character was, like, a bit more on the page, because, like, I really don't get, like, the hubbub around her, because, like, Emma really didn't like her for whatever reason. Emma didn't like her, and then Mrs. Elton is like obsessed with her for some reason, and Mr. Knightley's very fond of her, and now we find out Churchill has been engaged to her, and like she's just not very much on the page. She's kind of like this secret entity, so I wish I could like have developed more of an opinion around her, because when she came into play, I knew she would be important based on how she was brought into the narrative, but I was never really given much reason to care about her or root for her. I don't get the sickness thing with her. I was confused by the Dixon thing, which, again, now that we know that Churchill was with her the whole time, makes me wonder what Emma said to him, because Emma was very apparent in her opinions about everyone to him, so that's interesting. Emma has a fascination with marrying Harriet off, and Harriet, like, is an orphan and has, like, no sort of standing. Like, she's educated to a capacity, and I don't know much about this time, but I wonder, and I would like to hear people's thoughts below, was it possible for a woman like Harriet to, like, upscale in society and get to Emma's level? Okay, one more thing before I continue reading. Volume 3 is really turning around for me. I think I said that before, but this is really where we're seeing Emma's character growth. Emma realizing her past mistakes and like having actual guilt over her actions and how she behaves, and considering the thoughts and criticisms other people, mainly Knightley, have in her, and realizing their validity. So I thought it was gonna be, I don't know if I thought it was going to be faster or slower, but I wasn't convinced it was going to happen. And then we got into volume 3, and that's when everything's starting to click into place, and I'm now actually enjoying the novel a lot more. Emma just figured out on page 418 what I figured out on page like 50, that she wanted to marry Knightley. Character growth. So now I'm very curious to see how she's gonna handle this with with Harriet, because it was obvious to me that Harriet was interested in Knightley when Emma thought she was interested in Frank, and now Harriet has admitted to having feelings for Knightley, and Emma has now realized she has feelings for Knightley, and I think Knightley has feelings for Emma. So now with this character arc, I'm very interested to see how this goes down and how she ends up handling it, and like I'm like already like kind of cringing at the possibilities of what's gonna happen, because this is such an uncomfortable situation. So it seems like Emma kind of got around having to talk to Harriet, because she basically like broke up their friendship via like the 1800s version of text messaging, aka she sent her a letter. And didn't really explain anything, and just like kind of got her to go to her sister's house. And then Harriet Surprise is now getting married to Mr. Martin, so I feel like the plot really lucked Emma out on that one, so she didn't have to actually confront probably like the thing she should have been most guilty about of everything she did, but I guess everything worked out. I don't know. I'm not convinced by this plot point, but like everything else slid together very well, so like it's fine. I finally finished. I read like 100 pages today. I've been reading this book for a month, and it was very slow going. I took a lot of breaks from it. I liked this. I enjoyed the writing once I got into it and settled into it. I enjoyed the humor in it, and how it poked a lot of fun through the use of language. I was expecting a bit more from the character work than what I got, especially with some characters, Jane especially, as I mentioned before. And I did like Emma's character arc. I thought it was quite nice. I think that it was just a little too long. I'm not going to say that there wasn't intention behind every scene, but the middle of it dragged quite severely for me, and I was in volume 2 for weeks, and then I just read volume 3 over the course of a few days, because the plot and everything going on became interesting again, and everything was kind of coming to a head. So I get that there was like the build-up, but I felt like part 1 introduced a lot of like energy, and then part 2 like dragged, and then part 3 was exciting again. So yeah, I don't think it had to be 500 pages. So yeah, I think I'm just gonna end this vlog here and edit this and finally get this up at the end of August, when I was attempting to read this for Jane Austen July, but you know, I started it in July. It's the thought that counts. If you're still here, thank you for watching. I'd be really interested in people's thoughts on this, what people thought about like the thematic content. I didn't really get into like the class stuff all that much, because I don't really know much about this era and how class really worked, so there wasn't really much for me to pick apart. But yeah, that's all I got. So looking forward to having discussions in the comments, and until next time, happy reading.